2015. We're at about 11,000 net new businesses since I've taken office. Why that's important, what I was talking about before, that most jobs don't come 500 or 1,000 at a time. So now if you've got 11,000 or more people who've started up their own company, whether it's just one or two or a few more, but even if it's two, if 6 months from now those two become four, and then the four a year later become eight, and the eight becomes six, suddenly you start to have that compounding factor. And the fact that that many people are willing to take that risk, I think, is very telling.
And they do go hand in hand. If you have high unemployment, a lot of people have trouble finding a job, start a business.
Right, and historically, one of the other interesting things, and this was made at a national forum a year and a half or so ago I was at, they said that was one of the challenges, was that historically, not just in Wisconsin, but in America, oftentimes during times of slight recessions, many people who couldn't find work, that would be the time when they'd go out and start, say, well, heck, if I can't find one, to start their own company. And they mentioned how in this last recession, there's been a much lower rate of people going to start up their own companies. And, they had some theories. I don't know if, there's probably no one specific theory. One theory was extended unemployment benefits make it too easy to sit back. That could be part of it. But another one that to me was more concerning was that people just weren't, in general, consumer confidence had altered so much that people didn't have enough confidence that if they did that, they could successfully start and operate their own business. The fact that there are 11,000 in Wisconsin suggests that one of the biggest things I said we could help with is change the business climate, change the environment for creating jobs in this state, since I don't create the jobs. And I think that's been helpful. The surveys, people say, surveys are great, but they create jobs. But I think, it sets the table for the future. 4 years ago, the state chamber does their survey, 4% say we're in the right direction. Early this summer, it's up to 94%. The rankings start to show a difference. Even this monthly index that comes out, the co-index from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which is amusing to me that at least one of the papers in Madison claims that that's not comparable when on its website it actually says.
I have the quote here from the Cap Times. They attribute it to Paul Flora, senior economic analyst at the Federal Reserve.
Yep.
We do not consider state rankings based on the coincident leading indexes to be valid.
Which is funny because...
So why are you using it?
Well, because then they need to change their website. Because that guy is directly contradicting what it actually says on their website. It says it's for all 50 states, and it's viably, I don't know the exact quote, we can actually give it to you. It says it on their website even right now. It's why we put it out there when they put it out. To me, my guess is, and I wasn't conducting that interview, is that somebody asked them a leading question like, would you use this as the most reliable source for comparing states? But it says it for all 50 states right on the website that they put the information out. They, in fact, take it a step further, they actually put a map, which I tweet and Facebook post out there, a map of all 50 states with color coding with the ones on the top. So if it's not comparable, why would they list it by states? Why would they put it up there? Why would they put a statement on their website that says it's exactly for that? So that quote directly...
Fair comment. But do you take something like that where there's a contradiction, and does somebody on your team contact them and say, should we still be using this or not?
No, because the Capital Times, which is about the most biased paper in the country, putting that out to me is an aside. Now, if you talk to them or somebody else did, I'd probably pay a little differently. But to me, that's a good example where somebody used a quote not knowing what the context was. Our counter to that was saying, I don't need to contact them. It says it on their website. Now, if they change the website, if they go in and say, upon further review, we don't think the statement we put up on our website is accurate because it contradicts what that guy said, but it's still their website. To me, a quote from one person shouldn't trump what the official policy statement is on the website itself. And what they do with that is, we haven't said it's where you're at in terms of job creation. What it is about what they believe the future is. They look at a series of things. They look at unemployment, things related to housing, a number of other things packaged together and say, based upon this, we think in a few months back it was 5, then it was 3, then it was 2. We think those are good indicators. And those parallel what we said about the 11,000 jobs, or excuse me, 11,000 businesses created. That's not inconsistent with what we've seen. In fact, on top of that, they pointed out that from April through August, We had the largest job growth for that period since 1990, so the largest in 23 years. Are we done yet? No. Do I say that? My skeptics, the cynics about me will say, "Wow, he's trying to change the data." You didn't hear me back away from 250,000. I just explained to people why I believe, we've laid the groundwork, why the momentum's going in the right direction, why we're going to positive. It is interesting to me that some of the very people who seem to relish the state not being on pace yet, month by month, to get to 250,000, completely ignore that some of those same folks were in control of state government when we were losing 133,000 jobs.
Politics.
Right, no, and I don't say, it is, right, it is what it is, but I say people should be mindful of that, because sometimes I think people say, oh, well, are we succeeding or not if we're exactly on target for that pace, whereas I look at the comparison and say, so is the answer to go back to the policies that are in place? Granted, and I admit, it wasn't just in Wisconsin, there was a national recession,
Sure.
But we certainly didn't help things get any better when we had, multi-billion-dollar budget deficits. We had double-digit tax increases. We had some of the largest job loss we'd had in state history. To me, I don't think it's a coincidence that all those things were happening at the same time. And so what we've tried to do is, and even in terms of stability, what we were talking about at the beginning, even in terms of comparison between Wisconsin and Illinois, I think that's a fair comparison too, saying if we were to change policies, in real time you can see what you'd get if we changed ship completely. If we went and did the policies that my predecessor and his allies did in the past, if we did that going forward, what would it look like? It might look very much like what we see in Springfield right now. And even during that same time frame, our unemployment rate's down to 6.7%. Illinois still continues to hover above 9%. They're two very different views of the world.
Rockford often leads Illinois in unemployment. All I know is what I read in the papers. But there have been indications also reported that Wisconsin is growing. Wisconsin's growing jobs, but it's growing at a slower pace than the national rate, slower pace than most of the states surrounding us. Is there something in particular different in Wisconsin, wrong in Wisconsin?
Well, it's different.
Is it the recalls?
Totally. I think any objective observer has to, again, I tell you, do a story, go survey 50 employers if you want, and ask them in the first year and a half, did that have an impact? I think you'd be hard pressed to say that people wouldn't believe that. The numbers they talk about, we've talked about this before, there's the monthly numbers, which even when numbers are good, I remind people, are not very reliable because they're a sample of 3.5%. The quarterly numbers that come out for the federal government's Bureau of Labor Statistics and Department of Labor are of the reliable ones, they're the most reliable, or of the data, the most reliable, but they have a 6-month lag. So when we look at rankings and percentages, we're still looking, we didn't see the numbers for the first 2 years of my administration until almost the end of June. So a few months back, we won't see until end of December the first 2.5 years. So, for example, when people look at some of those numbers, you're still talking about, even the numbers that came out in June were numbers that were still fully within that time of the protest, the first and second round of recalls out there. So I think they have an impact. It's why I look at those projections I mentioned from the Federal Reserve Bank and say, well, they look at the growth, even if you don't compare it to other states. I won't even say where it compares to others, which is better than most in the Midwest, but they look at the growth being about double what they project the national growth would be for the next 6 months. That's where I start to see that curve saying there were logical, unanticipated challenges that people, even for employers who liked what we were doing, it wasn't that they didn't like it, they just were very conscious about questioning what was going to happen next. Were things going to shift? Was there going to be an about face? And so now you've seen that base has been set and things are stable now. It's why I mentioned even after the recalls last year saying, for example, right to work, other things like that I wasn't interested in pursuing those things regardless of what my ideological beliefs might be, because I didn't want anything else distracting from that stability, from kind of building that calm. Still pushing reasonable reform, but nothing that was going to bring 100,000 more people to the Capitol, because I thought from an employer base, they overwhelmingly, we heard, and we see it in the surveys, that employers like what we're doing, but they just want things to calm down, and that's what we've done. So I think you'll see in December, you'll see numbers for the first 2.5 years continue to go up. I think by next June, when you see the numbers for the first 3 years, you'll see a substantial growth, and you'll continue to see that pace go up.
Okay. Sean, I want to shift. I know you have a couple questions you want to ask, so go ahead.
Well, it's budget time around here. Specifically in the city of Beloit, they're obviously battling issues involving state funding either falling or staying flat, particularly with Beloit, and I'm sure most cities, public safety is the highest cost. In Beloit, it's about 2/3.
Right.
And then I think a couple years ago, the city actually laid off 10 workers, 5 firefighters, 5 police officers. It's sort of leaving the tools set by Act 10 as sort of inadequate to cover, to decrease those costs. So do you feel like Act 10 should expand to public safety workers for cities?
I get the concern that local officials have. The challenge that we had when we did it initially was I could cover the 24/7 operations of the state. I could, if need be. In fact, the only time we ever talked about the National Guard didn't have anything to do with the protesters. That entirely everything to do with the mental health facilities in our prisons, where if we needed to, if people walked off or slowed work down or something like that, we'd cover it. But I looked at, there's almost 1,800 municipalities, there's 72 counties. My great worry was if there was, even just at one spot, if there was any reduction in coverage, that for fire and police, that was just unacceptable. And so that's why I didn't include them. And it's not necessarily the case here in Beloit, but I have seen elsewhere across the state that even without them, fire and police being included in Act 10, increasingly you're starting to see more cities, more municipalities be able to settle for things that, while they don't completely change their collective bargaining, where they're getting closer to what they get from other public employees in terms of health care and in terms of pension contributions, and I think that will continue.
I think also kind of piggybacking on that, and specifically talking to smaller towns, I just had an interview with Roger Anklin, he's the town chair over at Town of Turtle, and I think his exact quote is they're feeling handicapped by the state. Levy limits, they're not able to increase their levy limits to create that lost revenue, and then also state funding falling. And then now in this new budget, the new fees schedule, where if they add a fee, they have to deduct that amount by the levy. So do you feel...
Actually, in the case of the towns actually saw an increase. The biggest portion, other than personnel of towns, are road aids. And road aids actually went up 4% in this budget, as it did for the counties and municipalities as well.
Their argument still is that it's not enough. It doesn't cover enough. They still have to add, I think in the town of Turtle, they had to add another, I can't remember the exact figure, but they had to add another few $10,000 or $15,000 to that budget in order to even just keep the streets minimum, where they don't have to rebuild them, which would cost even more. Mm-hmm. So do you feel, or...
But just one thing I just want to be clear though, in terms of this budget, there weren't cuts. What they want is more of an increase than the increase they got.
Right. And well, and
so that, and with any of the local governments, what we said, there's still provisions for many local governments to go to referendum if they want to go to referendum and get the voters to approve it. What they're essentially doing is, and we do this elsewhere, and I get them, they're good, decent people, and we try to work with local officials. I'm going to be at the town's meeting, I think, in a week or so, as well as with the counties. I was just with them and was with some of the Alliance of Cities and others, and we try to help them in other ways. But essentially what they're saying is we feel handicapped because the state isn't allowing us to jack up property taxes on the hardworking taxpayers of this state. And I said, for that one, yeah, I accept responsibility for that. To me, I think it's really important, particularly in tough economic times, that we're not seeing massive property tax increases. That's why we poured more money into the school aid formula as well. We've already put over $300 million more into school, so this additional $100 million wasn't for more school spending. It was to try and drive down property taxes in the same way that we're trying to keep municipal government, county government, and other local governments to keep from too much of a property tax increase.
Their argument is that you're stepping on their toes, and it's the local people that elect these people that to run that and be that responsible. Mm-hmm. And their argument is that you're micromanaging them on that state level. Is that?
I told them I was going to hold the line on property taxes as a governor, and the same people elected me. So I mean, those same local people have that control. You know, if they want a governor that's going to allow property taxes to go back to the way they were, which was in the last decade a 27% increase, then I'm not their guy, and I'm not going to be a guy that says it's good for property taxes to go up that much. If there are ways for us to say, can we continue to work in ways that can help and assist, and we put more resources in? Yeah, like I said, we put a 4% increase for towns, but they're going to have to find a way to balance that, or go to the voters for a referendum, which if they can make that case about taxes, then they can do it.
Would you ever consider increasing the levy limits or no?
To me, I think I just, when I was the county executive, I was a local official for 8 years. Not once did I increase the levy from the previous year. I had plenty of battles with my county board over it, but I just think I think property taxes in the state historically have been too high, and I think they're a real deterrent both particularly for seniors, working families, small businesses, farmers, but just in general. We talked before about attracting people in and businesses in from other states. That's been one of our ongoing challenges. So.
One of the ways, obviously, to increase this is for property values to increase. We're not seeing that in Beloit. We're seeing property values fall year in and year out. Is there a method that you would see it in terms of increasing the value of property, and how would the state help local municipalities do that?
Well, actually, again, having been a local official for 8 years, my promise was always the levy. Most politicians will say they're going to freeze or hold the rate.
Right.
That's a little smoke and mirrors, because then they up your assessments and they make it up. Versus the levy is how much you spend. It's like you say here, we're going to, whatever the budget is, $1 million, just hypothetically, and say we're going to live within it, or we're going to raise it 5% or whatever it is. That's what you got. It's not, and so the dynamics though about the assessed value. Yeah, I mean it's. I get why local governments want to continue to update that so it's fair as to who's got a higher value property or not. But within a given jurisdiction, it shouldn't matter. Here's what I mean by that is, if your levy is $1 million, obviously it's more, but just for example, and you've got 100 properties, and some go up in value and some go down. That should alter what each of those individual properties pay, but the levy itself shouldn't change unless you're raising the levy. It's just a redistribution as to who, if my property went up 25%, then I should be paying 25% more in a levy. If my neighbors went down, it should be paying proportionately less. But in terms of so when they say that about value, there's that. It's reassessing. Hypothetically, if you're not increasing the levy, and you change the appraisals of the homes and properties within the area, it still shouldn't change how much they can levy, because it's just a redistribution of who pays a higher or lower mill rate off of all it.
Back to you. Some other ones.
Okay, shift gears. It won't surprise you that people in Beloit are watching the Kenosha casino situation closely, because we're, we think after all these many years we might be up to bat next. Excuse me while I sound a little bit lawyerly here, but I want to read to you language from the Ho-Chunk Compact with the state as amended from paragraph 9, page 4, Second Amendment, modifying paragraph 5 of the First Amendment. That's the lawyerly part.
It did sound lawyerly.
Yes, it did. The Ho-Chunk believe this entitles them to a fourth casino. The language quoting, except for conducting Class 3 gaming at Dejoke within the city of Madison, the state and the nation hereby amend section XXVIIB by agreeing upon delivery to the governor, resolution of support approved by county, or if the site is located within a city, by the city, authorizing Class 3 gaming, the governor shall approve the site as the nation's fourth location on the compact. And that, again, says the governor shall approve, not the governor may approve. The state and the Ho-Chunk executed the compact. Do you feel does that bind you to approve a fourth site for the Ho-Chunk?
It's one that, interestingly enough, in all this debate, and let me go back for a second, I'm not skipping out on this, I'll come back to answer that, but in context, in fact, I started in the transition before I was governor. My predecessor met with all 11 tribes once a year for consultation. I changed it. I do a quarterly meeting, and I go to a different site around the state. So I'm at a different tribal government hosting, just because I thought it was important to have more frequent communications and that, because Republican or Democrat alike, there's always been tensions, some more than others, between the tribal governments. And so early on in 2011, I think it was something like June or July, I forget, when I was in Lac de Flambeau, I was asked about what my criteria being. You know, Kenosha's for years, for almost 2 decades, it's been imminent. Only the federal government can 20 years be imminent, but imminent
Same here.
something was going to happen, right? Similar here. And so I laid out per the request. I said whether anywhere, at least my reaction, it didn't matter, was Kenosha, could be Shullsburg, could be Sheboygan, could be anywhere that place it talked about. 3 criteria I would set. Get back to your specific question about the compact. And I said, the first one's obvious. There should be community support. That one's pretty self-apparent. So the second one, there should be a consensus amongst all 11 tribal governments. And I'll explain that in a second. And I said, third, I felt the last time the voters had a say in it, granted it was about 20 years ago, but was when they passed in the early 90s, the referendum, there were 5 advisory referendum questions, I remember right. One of them was, should there be expanded gambling in the state? And the answer was no. And so I said, you got to find some way to show me how this is not expanded gambling. On the second one, which has gotten the most attention, people say, free market. Well, Indian gaming is not, gambling in the state's not a free market. It's a highly regulated monopoly. If there's a free market, Steve Wynn or Donald Trump could come in and build something. You can't. It's why the federal government and the governor have to sign off on it. It is a highly regulated monopoly. And per part of what you're referencing, I said there are compacts in place negotiated long before I was governor. And my sense was, up until reading about this actually in your paper recently, the Ho-Chunk haven't brought this up to me. So this is not something they've invoked or threatened or anything else like that. I've just been reading about it. You hear rumblings about, because people say to me, why would the Ho-Chunk be so against Kenosha if they've got one pending, or could have one pending in Beloit? And we had heard of it up until President Greendeer brought it up, I think, in your paper here.
Yeah.
We hadn't even gone back and looked at that provision, because like I said, they were negotiating long before I was governor, almost a decade ago. But they hadn't invoked that, which makes sense as to why they're, at least why they on the surface feel fairly confident. That aside, why, just in general, I picked the consensus, and I'm not unique. Michigan, for example, has a requirement by law, by statute, before you can even apply for an off-reservation gaming site, all the tribes in Michigan have to sign off an agreement. The reason why I do that is, like I say, it's not a monopoly. I mean, it's not a free market. It is a monopoly. In my sense, is 11 tribes have done compacts with the state. They negotiated terms that they thought were appropriate at the time they did them. If you dramatically alter that, which there's no doubt for both the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee, or in the Potawatomi, to a certain extent for the Oneida, although they appear to work that out with the Menominee, the reality is that it will dramatically impact each of those tribal governments. Now, there's a debate between Menominee and the other two as to what degree of an impact there is, but there's no dispute there'd be one, and then the question is how much. And so I said it's only fair that you should agree to some sort of a consensus, which to me meant all 11. People say consensus, does that mean a supermajority? I'm like, no, consensus means we may not all like it, but I said we're not leaving this room until we get a consensus on what we're going to call this program. We may say, okay, to get out, we'll agree on a name that none of us really totally like, but we'll figure out some way to make it enough that we can accept it.
What if the legislature had to reach that level to pass a bill?
Well,
isn't that a barrier that's almost impossible to clear?
But I said this is not unique. Other states have it. Michigan has it in the law before they can even apply. You've had Minnesota's tribal leaders, the entire state, sent us a letter saying they think our criteria for off reservation. Remember, this is because a lot of these tribal groups go around the country and say if you got a monopoly. The argument was, even with the federal government, why they made those changes was so that tribal governments that had, for whether you agree or disagree, that had been disadvantaged historically, could have access on their reservation sites to gaming opportunities that would then be used to help improve their conditions and things of that nature. And like I said, it's a whole different scenario. The better example of the legislature would be is if people want a free market, then change put a constitutional amendment up, change the Constitution, and let anybody come in. That's what they have in Illinois. Now, they still have 10 licenses, so I guess it's probably more like Vegas or other places where anybody can do it. But with gambling, there are limits. In this case, there are limits just in Indian gaming. So that's why the criteria I set up was the way that I did. And people don't have to agree with it, but at least it makes some sense.
Well, if now you have the Potawatomi and the Ho-Chunk as recently as Friday saying that they're adamantly opposed to the Menominee, yet you delayed your decision. I mean, it doesn't two tribes then mean the deal is off?
Well, that's part of the criteria we're going to review. Now, the Menominee made a very interesting legal argument that I said at least deserves the due diligence to look at it, because obviously they put a lot of time and effort. Some people might immediately dismiss it. We're looking at their argument is, going back to compact language, that because both the Ho-Chunk and Menominee as well as the Lac de Flambeau included provisions that said if a casino is built somewhere else, some very specifically to a radius around Kenosha, then certain things happen. For example, the Ho-Chunk have a provision. Not only do they not have, if they can show losses, not only do they not have to pay to the state their compact fees, it actually could be to a point where depending on the enforcement language, where they could actually invoke that the state pay them even beyond what they have to get refunded in their compact, depending on how much they can prove they lose. And it's just, ideally, when I set the language more than 2 years ago, my hope was it would force them to come to the table and say, if I was the Menominee, and I had a meeting 2 weeks ago in my office where I had my conference room where I had Menominee, Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Oneida, and said, let's talk about what would it take? What would it take? Is there a way financially to mitigate whatever harm those three tribes, and Oneida subsequently got to a point where they could do that, but the Ho-Chunk and Potawatomi were the bigger ones. Say, what would it take to mitigate whatever lost revenue you think you're going to get and can quantify, and in turn the jobs, because that's the other part. Menominee talks about 3,000 permanent jobs up to 2,000 construction jobs, but you have similar numbers that the Potawatomi and the Ho-Chunk contend they would lose because of lost revenue. And I look at all this and say, even that's not a slam dunk on jobs, because if it's you gain them here but you lose them here and here, where's the value and all that? My hope had been they'd find some way to mitigate that. Where the barrier is that Menominee had put a proposal on the table. Both the other tribes had said it's nowhere near even close to what they get, and it's frustrating. I've tried to again be genuine with this. I've gone back and forth and said, okay, to the Menominee, how would you quantify that? And they said, well, go to any number, and they renewed this call on Friday of objective firms that could look at it, because everybody can hire a firm. Well, interesting enough, one of the examples they gave me in the meeting was they said go to this innovation group. Well, innovation group, I just knew because the Secretary Hips passes on each week all the different information he gets from folks. Innovation group was a firm that did a report for the Ho-Chunk that found that they'd lose almost $20 million each year from something like this. Well, and then in fairness, the Menominee's representatives said, well, yeah, but there's a difference between different class of the place in Madison is different than the one in Baraboo. But it's still a loss. I mean, it seems like people are playing a little bit with semantics, saying, well, it's not to this class.
It all sounds like talking points.
Right. Well, that's why I said at these meetings, I said, stop the talking points and let's just figure out a deal. So that's where, just in context with Kenosha, where we're at. In terms of, back to your specific question on that, without that language, without that being brought up, I'd apply the same standard, like I said to anybody. That's why I set it out 2 years ago. At that point, not having any idea whether Kenosha, Beloit, Schulzberg, anybody would ever get approved. As much as people said Kenosha was imminent, I'd heard that for years. Sure. So that's not that's not like it was, I said only the federal government do years go by and it's called imminent. But for this new language, we'd have to look at it. Like, obviously I wasn't involved, nor was my administration negotiating it. We'd have to look at what is the state legally obligated to in terms of
So
language?
at this
out there?
point, in terms of whether it binds you or not, you don't know.
No, I don't know. I mean, all I've known is I've heard rumblings about that before. When you all wrote it in the paper, obviously it caught our attention because they said, aha, okay, that makes sense as to why the rumbling out there was one of the Ho-Chunk feel they got something different because of their compact. Because that wasn't on the table in front of us right now, we really had, I get enough work to do on the research on the Kenosha site. We hadn't looked at the other, and whether they could or they couldn't. It's if hypothetically, the legal interpretation is yes, indeed, that would, if approved, require the state legally to approve one just automatically per the compact. Whether that's accurate or not really doesn't have a bearing to me on Kenosha one way or the other, because the criteria I set was just in general for any site out there.
Okay.